This is Ogrodowski of WeAreChange.org here in England, and I'm joined by the one and only David Icke. Now, David, you have been making many predictions about World War III, and a lot of things you've been saying throughout the years have slowly been coming together. Right now, with the situation in ISIS, how do you break it down? What's your understanding of it?
Well, world wars change worlds. And if you have a global agenda, then global problems allow you to offer global solutions. And if you look how the world was transformed by the First World War and the Second World War, the world was a completely different place after both of those wars. And the idea all along has been to have a Third World War to complete the transformation into a global state with a world government and a world army dictating to the global population. And there was a letter, a controversial letter, because people dismiss it, but with the passage of events, it becomes more and more credible. And it was a letter written by a man called Albert Pike, who was a massive Freemason in the United States in the 19th century. And it was to another Illuminati infamous character called Mazzini, Giuseppe Mazzini. And it detailed 3 world wars that would transform global society. And the first one described it in the terms that happened. The second one it described in terms that it happened. But, you can say, well, it came to light later, so, maybe they just put that in and faked the accuracy of the first 2 wars. So the credibility of what it said lies in what it said about the Third World War. And it talked about creating a conflict between the Muslim world and what it called political Zionism. And people will say, well, that's got to be a fake because there was no Zionism when that letter was supposed to be written. Well, this is an agenda that's projected a long way forward. This is why Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, and Eric Blair, George Orwell, 1984, who knew each other. Huxley taught George Orwell French at Eton College, where the royals go, and they knew each other and they became friends. And from the same sources, not least the Fabian Society in Britain, they understood the projected agenda. And we're talking there in 1932 that Huxley's book was published, 1948 that Orwell's book was published, and they are describing the society that's unfolding today at that time. And there are many other examples of people predicting the future who were insiders who have turned out to be incredibly accurate. So the idea that Albert Pike would know that this Zionist movement was coming and the establishment of Israel was coming is very credible when you look at the background evidence. And of course, Zionism was established not that long after this letter was supposed to be written. And so he was talking about the Muslim world being brought into a war with the political Zionism, what today we call Israel, and that this would, in my terms, create a vortex that would draw in the world, in our terms, America, the European Union, NATO, into this war. And what you have now is a situation that this ISIS group has come out of nowhere, in effect, incredibly well armed, incredibly funded. I mean, I've seen figures like $2 billion at its disposal. And it's walking into towns in Iraq and taking them over. It's established itself at the key border crossings into Syria and into Jordan. And it's all happened really fast. And what the potential of this clearly is to do what Pike was talking about. Because I've said in my books for years that the plan was to create a massive divide and rule conflict between the Shia Muslims and the Sunni Muslims. I mean, I know it's hard to believe for anyone frickin' sane, but this argument over this ancient argument over who should, be the natural successor to the rightful successor to Muhammad and all that stuff has created this enormous schism, and schisms are there to be manipulated and exploited by these people. So what you have, therefore, is this ISIS that suddenly appeared with its grotesque violence that is representing Sunni Muslims. And then you have the regime currently in Iraq that is representing, in effect, Shia Muslims. And you have, just across the border, the center of the Shia Muslim world, and that's Iran. Iran, 89%, I think it is, of Iranian Muslims are Shia. Now, in the last little while, there's been this, apparently on the face of it, this strange change of direction by America in terms of Iran. They've spent all these years with Israel saying, well, we must take out their nuclear facilities and these sanctions against them, and all they're terrible. And now, if you remember, in the last week or so, they've even been talking about maybe they ought to get into discussions with Iran and come to some agreement on how they deal with this ISIS situation. And it's like, what? Yeah. But when you come from this perspective, what they're doing is they're trying to draw Iran into this Sunni Shia conflict, like, protect the Shia that this Sunni ISIS are threatening and overrunning at the moment. And once they get Iran pulled into that vortex, it ain't going to get out. Yep. Then there's another aspect of this, which is a real red flag for me. And that is this ISIS organization is very extreme. And its very name, when you break down the wording, is describing its ambitions. And that's to take over Iraq, to take over Syria, and to take over what they call the Levant. And what does the Levant include? Israel. So here you have this extreme Muslim group, or actually the army, actually saying in its own name that our intention is to take over the Levant, to take over Israel. And you'd think at any other time, even with a lesser situation, Netanyahu would be surrounded by microphones and he'd be saying, we must be protected, Israel is in danger. Instead, he's come out and said, oh, no problem, you leave them to it. America, no, don't intervene, leave them to it, let them basically weaken each other. And then you've got the United States, their reaction. It sums up the ludicrous nature of it, that John Kerry has gone to Iraq and he said, well, we know about bloody airstrikes because, we might kill civilians. Well, that's never stopped you in the past, mate, has it? Or any of your predecessors. And what it seems to me as I'm reading this is that they're all standing off to let this ISIS get a big foothold in that region. And then if it moves to the point where it starts to threaten Israel, then the button will be pressed. Then the Americans and NATO will come in because they're committed to protecting Israel's security. And then you'll start to see why that sliver of land called Israel, with less than 8 million people, has one of the best equipped armies in the world and a nuclear arsenal. Yeah. Because what Pike was talking about was drawing all these different disparate groups in and creating this vortex of mutual self-destruction, which would change the war that would change the world, taking on from the previous world wars that changed the world, and then at that point their global fascist society would be brought in. No doubt justified by, we need a world government and we need a world army to stop this ever happening again, even though we who are saying that actually created it. And then you've got what I've been saying now way back in the 1990s. The idea is for this Third World War to involve Russia and China against the West.
Yeah. Oceania versus Eurasia. Yeah.
Yeah, in the 1984 kind of scenario. And what you have now is the demonization of Russia. Have you noticed that? How suddenly we got the demonization of Russia? And what's opening up in the Ukraine, while all this is starting to go on in the Middle East, is another front against Russia. Because, you know, it's very easy to see how Russia can be pulled into this Middle Eastern conflict by supporting Syria, because destroying Syria is part of ISIS's agenda and American agenda and NATO's agenda.
And also Iran as well.
Yeah, and destroying Iran. Yeah, so and Russia would come out in support of Iran, and the same would happen with China. And so you can see how it's how the pieces in the game are being moved around to create this scenario that Pike talked about. And the idea is to basically bring everything to its knees, so that the world would have to be rebuilt in its structure and the way it operates, and that would be in the image of what they've been working towards all along: world government, world central bank, world army, world currency, centralized control of the planet, and it's very easy to see with current events how it's moving in that direction, and we need to understand what the goals are, to understand what the moves towards that goal are. And when you look at it from this perspective, what is happening in the Middle East is not random. None of it's been random. Libya's not been random. Syria's not been random. None of it. And ISIS certainly isn't random. It's part of this long-term plan to take over the world by creating enormous chaos, to which they can offer the order out of the chaos, their order, their new world order.
Problem, reaction, solution, order out of chaos. You know, they set up the problem, U.S. funds with NATO, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, ISIS in Syria to go after Assad. They stop, Russia stops the U.S. from attacking them, so they find a different way. Now ISIS is running loose. Israel, for the first time ever, is saying it's not even a problem. Yeah. Meanwhile, they backed everything from the very beginning, and they're creating this awful situation. They're bringing Iran into it, meanwhile financing both sides of the situation. Iran is now fighting in Iraq, and China and Russia are standing by. They're being agitated in Ukraine with the bombing in Donetsk and Slavansk right now. Ukraine is pretty much asking for Russians to come over with all the bombs that they're dropping on them.
Yeah, in fact, a close aide of President Putin, who has special responsibility for Ukraine, has actually said this week that the United States is preparing for a war against Russia through Ukraine, and that what they plan is to try to take Crimea back. Now, you can have the odd bit of terrorism and bad things happen in Ukraine to Russian supporting people, and Putin can stay back and hold his fire because he knows what they're trying to manipulate him into. But if they try to take Crimea back, Putin's ego and Putin's pride will no way, I would strongly suspect, allow him just to let them do it.
Exactly.
And therefore, that if they try to take Crimea back, then what you're looking at is a war, or a calculated war against Russia.
Yeah.
And if you start a front against Russia on its borders, and then all this stuff going on in the Middle East, you are diluting Russia's impact on what's happening in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And it's all a setup. And when you have Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who are 51st states of the United States, there are many of those, mind, funding this ISIS and funding this terrorism, while the Americans, who could tell them to stop any time, are saying, are condemning the very terrorism that their 51st states are supporting. Well, the picture's so bloody obvious. It's a setup, and it's a setup to attempt to trigger World War III.
And that's why you see Russia trying to back their economy with gold. That's why they're making better business relations with China. They're selling oil to each other right now, and they're moving away from all this.
Yeah.
But Putin's ego is very strong. They could provoke him, and you don't know how Putin will respond. That's what they were discussing at the Bilderberg meeting just a few weeks ago, when it came out that they were discussing if they should raise the NATO defense budget. What should they do in Ukraine, and how can we understand Putin? How can we use the situation with Putin? It came out in the Bilderberg meetings that they're discussing this. So you can only imagine what NATO arms dealers, oil oligarchs of the Western power elite are going to have an interest when it comes to important decisions like this. Is there anything else that we need to understand about this kind of creation of war that's happening right in front of our eyes?
Well, it's a progression. And you have to connect the dots to see the progression. Going into Afghanistan was stage one, justified by the lie about 9/11 and who was really behind it. Then they go into Iraq. That has created the situation where this ISIS can now run riot. They want to go down into Africa, and so they're creating terrorism all over Africa. And so one of the big blocks to what they wanted was Colonel Gaddafi. And so they had to get rid of him. That was what the Libya thing was about, where they trained, armed and funded rebels to attack the Gaddafi regime.
Al-Qaeda rebels at that, when we're supposed to be fighting Al-Qaeda.
Exactly. And to attack the Gaddafi regime. And when they responded, it was, he's killing his own people. No, he's responding to people you funded to attack him. And then these rebels and others then moved into Syria after they'd done the thing in Libya, and they did the same there. And they thought that Syria would go like Libya, but it hasn't. That's been a big problem for them. And when they wanted to, because they were behind the time, they wanted to push that on. That's when they did the chemical weapons scam, which was not Assad's work at all. That would have been suicide. He's not that stupid.
It worked in Iraq once, and then Russia came in, stepped in, blocked it off, and also popular support stopped the war in Syria.
Yeah, and your popular rejection of bombing another country stopped that being pushed on. So they're behind time on Syria. But that moves then into ISIS. By arming ISIS, the Americans allow them to also supply the terrorists in Syria, which they also control. It's all unfolding with the magician behind, or the puppet master behind the scenes. And when we realize that, we can see that events are not random, but coldly calculated. These people are sheer, undiluted evil. And people need to understand that. Otherwise, they will reject that anyone could do what they're doing and kill and maim and slaughter so many people. They can do it because they have no heart, they have no empathy, they have no emotional compassion, and thus mayhem is their currency, and they have no emotional consequence. They are not like us, so don't judge what they'll do by what you would do, because it ain't the same thing.
To understand the future, we have to understand the past. David, thank you so much.
A drone, an unmanned drone flew over here. It's training, it's urban warfare. Identify yourself, fully loaded assault rifles.
Go across the street, sir. I understand legally, constitutionally, I do not have to go. Let me call it. Yeah. This is a public sidewalk. You know my rights like the back of my hand, and there's nothing in the penal code that says that you can't film on a public sidewalk.
That's not the only law.
All right, listen.